Mira was just 6 years old when everything changed for her. It was supposed to be a fun family trip, a short visit to a busy city where her parents had some errands to run. She held her mother's hand tightly as they moved through the crowd, her little fingers barely able to wrap around the warmth she felt. Myra's parents were talking quietly, making sure she understood where they were going and what she needed to do while they were away. "Stand right here, Mira," her mother said, pointing to a spot near a big bus terminal bench. "We will be back soon. Don't move, don't follow anyone, just stay right here, okay?" Mira nodded seriously. She knew she was supposed to obey, and she trusted them completely. At first she wasn't scared. She had been at busy places before and she thought her parents would be back any minute. The terminal was bustling with people rushing to catch buses, some talking loudly on their phones, some dragging heavy luggage. Mira watched everything around her with wide, curious eyes. There were bright advertisements on the walls, colorful signs showing bus timings, and small kiosks selling snacks. She tried to keep herself busy by looking at all the little things, but soon she realized that the crowd moved too fast. She felt tiny in comparison. Minutes turned into an hour, and Mira started to feel uneasy. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, expecting her to appear from somewhere nearby, but there was no one. She looked around frantically, scanning every face that passed, hoping to see her parents' familiar smiles. Myra's stomach felt tight with worry. She wanted to call out, but her mother's instructions were clear: don't move from this spot, so she stayed put. Clutching her little backpack, her heart racing with confusion. As time passed, the worry began to turn into fear. The voices around her seemed louder now, the people moving faster, and the terminal felt bigger than ever. Mira's small legs started to ache, and she sat down on the edge of the bench, hugging her knees. She thought about her parents. Where were they? Why hadn't they returned? She tried to remember if she had done anything wrong, but nothing came to mind. Everything had been normal. She had just waited, just like she was told. Eventually, some employees noticed her sitting alone. They came over and asked her questions, but Mira only repeated, "I'm waiting for my mom and dad. They will come back. I have to wait here." The adults tried to explain that sometimes parents need to take care of things, but Mira was insistent. She couldn't understand why they weren't there yet. She thought that maybe they were running late or got stuck somewhere. Her young mind couldn't imagine that something worse might have happened. The staff tried to make her comfortable, offering her snacks and water, but Mira refused to leave her spot. She told them she couldn't move because her parents would get worried if they saw her gone. Mira's eyes followed every person entering the terminal, hoping against hope that one of them was her mother or father. She memorized every detail of the place. The green trash can near the ticket counter, the blue bench under the big clock, the smell of fresh bread from a nearby stall. Everything became important to her because it was the place where she was waiting for her family. As evening approached, the terminal grew quieter. People left, buses departed, and the sky outside turned orange and pink. Myra's hope didn't fade completely, but the anxiety started to settle deeper in her chest. She didn't fully understand time, so she couldn't know how long she had been there. She just knew she had to stay. Night fell, and the terminal lights came on, casting shadows around her. Mira felt a chill, but she wrapped her little arms around herself and tried to remember her mother's words. "We will come back soon. Don't move." Some kind strangers stayed near her to keep her company. They tried to talk to her, but Myra's answers were always the same. She couldn't leave because leaving meant giving up on her parents finding her. Even when authorities arrived to take her to a safer place, she protested quietly, her small voice trembling, but full of determination. She wanted to stay at the spot. She wanted to wait. In her mind, that little space in the terminal was the only connection she still had with her family. By the next day, the staff realized that Mira was persistent and brave in a way they hadn't often seen. Many children might have cried or wandered off, but Mira held on to her hope tightly. She told herself that if she just stayed in the same spot, her parents would return and everything would be like before. Her trust in them was unshakable, even though she didn't know that her world had already changed in ways she couldn't imagine. In the shelter, Mira clung to the idea of that spot, describing it to anyone who would listen. She drew maps in her small notebook, sketching the bench, the clock, and the nearby kiosk. She remembered the colors, the sounds, and even the smells. It became her personal landmark, a sacred place in her mind that held the promise of her parents' return. Every day she would ask when she could go back. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being faithful to the hope that kept her going. Her story spread quietly among the staff and volunteers. They admired her determination, her innocence, and the way she held on to hope in such a cruel situation. Myra's waiting wasn't just about patience. It was about love, trust, and the belief that her parents would never leave her. She became a symbol for the idea that even in moments of fear and uncertainty, a child's hope can shine through. Mira's experience at the bus terminal became the first chapter of a life marked by waiting and resilience. She didn't know yet how long she would have to wait, or how the rest of her life would unfold. But that first day planted a seed of courage inside her. She learned to observe, to remember, and to hold on. Even in the face of confusion and fear, she refused to give up. Every minute she stayed in that spot was a testament to her love for her parents and her belief that one day they would return, if you want. I can do the same for part 2 and make it equally detailed and emotionally engaging in simple English. So the story builds naturally. Do you want me to do that next? Mira grew up carrying the memory of that bus terminal like a small, invisible backpack she never took off. Even though she had been moved to a foster home after her first day alone, the image of that spot, the bench under the big clock, the colorful kiosks, the smell of fresh bread stayed with her as if it were a piece of her soul. Every detail was etched in her mind, and no matter how many new people came into her life, or how many different homes she lived in, she could close her eyes and picture that exact place. It wasn't just a memory. It was a promise she had made to herself that one day she would return and wait for her parents again, no matter what. As Mira grew older, this ritual became a part of her life. Every year on the same day she had first been left behind, she would find a way to go back to that spot. At first it was easier because the shelter staff knew of her routine and allowed her small trips with supervision. Later, as she became more independent, she learned to go on her own, navigating the busy streets with a mix of careful planning and determination. People in her neighborhood began to notice a quiet, solemn girl who would disappear for hours only, to return, sometimes with a notebook full of sketches or a backpack full of drawings of that bus terminal. When Mira arrived at the terminal each year, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Her heart would race with hope, imagining the moment her parents might finally appear. At the same time, there was a sharp pang of anxiety, a little voice inside, reminding her that maybe, just maybe, they would not come. But she didn't let fear stop her. She had learned to sit quietly on that familiar bench, to watch the buses come and go, to notice the faces of strangers, and to believe that her parents were out there somewhere, even if she couldn't see them. The years shaped Myra in ways no child's routine should have to endure. She became observant, watching how people moved, how the staff at the terminal acted, even how the light changed on the walls during different times of day. Each year, she noticed something new, small details that others would miss. A pigeon hopping near the bench, a man selling newspapers with a friendly smile, the way the cleaning staff carefully polished the floor every evening. These details became her companions, and she began to feel a strange sense of familiarity with the people who worked there. Some of them even came to recognize her. Noting her quiet determination and the red ribbon she always wore in her hair, tied exactly as her mother had tied it years ago. Her friends in school and at the foster home sometimes asked her why she spent so much time at that terminal. Mira would simply smile and say she was waiting. They didn't understand, and most adults didn't either. They saw a ritual that seemed strange, even obsessive, but Myra didn't care. In her mind, the terminal was more than a place. It was a bridge to her family, a connection that no one could take away from her. The bench under the big clock was her anchor in a world that often felt unpredictable and unfair. Myra's patience was remarkable for someone so young. While other children were learning to ride bikes or play games, she was learning the art of waiting, of holding on to hope, and of understanding people from a distance. She began to notice patterns, the way buses arrived on time, the habits of the staff, the small routines that made the terminal feel alive. Watching the people pass by, She imagined which faces could belong to her parents. Each stranger became a possibility, a flicker of hope that made her heart leap for a moment before reality would remind her of the truth. Despite her patience and careful observation, Mira also learned to cope with disappointment. Every year when her parents didn't appear, she felt the familiar ache of sadness. But instead of giving up, she allowed herself to feel it fully and then tucked it away until the next year. This taught her resilience, a strength that few children of her age possessed. She learned to balance hope with reality, to live in a world where waiting was painful but necessary. During these visits, Mira also began to create small rituals that made her time at the terminal meaningful. She would bring a notebook and draw. The scene around her, capturing the benches, the clocks, and the people in sketches that were almost like a journal. She wrote notes to herself, letters she never intended to send, describing her hopes, fears, and observations. These writings became a secret world where she could express the emotions she couldn't speak aloud. Sometimes she imagined that if her parents were ever to return, they would find her there. They would understand everything she had been through just by looking at her notes. As Mira entered her teenage years, her annual visits became more determined. She would take the bus herself, navigate the streets alone, and spend hours waiting in her familiar spot. The terminal was no longer just a memory. It was a part of her identity. She wore her red ribbon every year, the same way her mother had tied it, as if it could act as a signal to her parents, guiding them back to her. She began to notice subtle changes in the terminal, the repainting of walls, new shops, different staff, but no matter what changed, the bench under the clock remained her anchor, unchanged and steady. Over time, some of the regular staff and local vendors began to know Myra personally. They admired her dedication, her quiet patience, and her unwavering belief that her parents would return. Some tried to talk to her, offering advice or consolation, but Mira politely declined. She wasn't there for anyone else. Her waiting was private, sacred. It was a commitment to herself and the memory of her family. No one else could interfere. Mira's visits also helped her develop a deep understanding of human behavior. She learned to read expressions, to notice body language, to interpret fleeting glances. Watching people come and go, she became sensitive to emotions, joy, sadness, frustration, and hope. These observations didn't just make her more aware, they shaped her empathy. Mira understood that everyone carried their own burdens, even if they didn't show them. She began to appreciate kindness in small gestures, a smile, a wave, or a moment of patience. Even with all the lessons she learned and the growth she has experienced, Myra never lost sight of the reason she returned to the terminal. Each year, she sat in her spot, watching, hoping, and waiting. She carried the memory of that first day like a flame she refused to let die. While others might have moved on, accepted the loss, or forgotten, Mira's loyalty to that spot and to the hope of her parents' return never wavered. Her annual ritual shaped the person she was becoming, resilient, observant, patient, and quietly brave. Mira's life revolved around that bench, the clock, and the memories of a family she still longed to be reunited with. Over the years, the sea terminal became a symbol of her love, determination, and unwavering hope, a place that reminded her that even when life is uncertain, some connections are too strong to be forgotten. Mira had been returning to the same bus terminal every year for as long as she could remember. Over time, her quiet presence at the familiar spot became something of a fixture, noticed by those who worked there regularly. Most people only glanced at her briefly, seeing a girl who seemed lost in thought or lost in her own world. But for Elias, a social worker who spent his days helping children and families in the area, Myra's routine caught his attention in a way that made him pause. At first, he thought she might be another child waiting for a parent or someone in need of assistance. But as he observed her quietly over weeks, he realized there was something different about her. She wasn't wandering aimlessly or asking strangers for help. She was waiting. And not for just a few minutes. She returned year after year, always to the same spot. Always at the same time. Elias had seen many stories of children who had been abandoned or separated from their families. But there was a quiet determination in Myra that made him curious. He noticed the red ribbon she always wore in her hair, neatly tied, as if it were a sign of hope she refused to let go of. He watched her sit on the same bench, her small hands resting on her knees, eyes scanning the crowd, always searching. It was clear to him that this wasn't just a habit. It was a ritual, and it was fueled by something deeper than fear. It was fueled by love and belief. Over time, he began to understand that Myra had been carrying this hope for years, alone, without anyone noticing or understanding the weight of it. At first, Elias didn't approach her. He wanted to make sure he wasn't intruding. He spent hours simply observing from a distance, noticing how Myra interacted or didn't interact with the people around her. She didn't ask for attention, she didn't cry for help, and she didn't complain. She just waited, quietly and patiently, her body language small but filled with resolve. Elias began to feel a mixture of admiration and concern. He could see that Myra was strong, but he also understood the loneliness and the emotional burden that came with such unwavering hope. He wanted to reach out, but he knew he had to be careful. This was not just a child who needed guidance. This was a child who needed someone who could understand her. Without disrupting the delicate balance she had created in her life, after weeks of watching, Elias finally decided to approach Myra. He walked slowly toward her, making sure his presence wasn't alarming. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, calm, and patient. "Hi, I'm Elias," he said. "I've seen you here before. Can I sit with you for a little while?" Myra looked up, startled at first. She was wary of strangers, as any child would be. But there was something different about Elias. There was no rush, no expectation, no pity in his tone. Just a quiet curiosity and kindness that felt safe. Myra hesitated, then nodded slightly, allowing him to sit on the edge of the bench. At first, Myra didn't speak much. She wasn't used to opening up to strangers, especially not adults. But Elias didn't push her. He simply waited, asking small, gentle questions, letting her answer on her own terms. Over time, Myra began to tell him little pieces of her story. She spoke about her first day at the terminal, how her parents had left her there, how she had waited, believing they would return. She explained how she had kept returning each year, no matter where she was living or what her life had become. Her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of years of hope, fear, and determination. Elias listened carefully, making sure Myra knew that he understood without judgment. He could see the pain in her eyes, the longing that had never faded. But he also saw her strength, the resilience that had allowed her to continue waiting all these years. For Myra, sharing her story was both frightening and liberating. She had carried it alone for so long that speaking it aloud felt like opening a door she hadn't dared to touch. And yet, for the first time, she felt that someone truly saw her not as a lost child. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a person whose story mattered. Once Myra felt safe, Elias began asking questions that helped him understand more about her past. He asked about her parents, the day she had first been left, and the details she remembered about the terminal. Myra's memory was sharp. She could recall colors, sounds, smells, and small details that no one else had noticed. Her descriptions painted a vivid picture of a little girl waiting with unwavering hope. And it became clear to Elias that her story was more than a tale of abandonment. It was a story of loyalty, patience, and love. As their conversations continued, Elias realized that Myra needed more than just listening. She needed someone to help her uncover the truth. He knew that the longer she waited without knowing what had happened to her parents, the more her hope could turn into a burden. Carefully, he explained that he might be able to help her find answers, but he wanted to do it only if she was ready. Myra was hesitant. She had spent years imagining her parents returning on their own. And the thought of the truth, whatever it might be, was frightening. But Elias's patience and gentle approach gave her confidence. She agreed to let him help, though she didn't know what the journey would bring. Elias began to gather information slowly, working quietly in the background while maintaining Myra's trust. He looked through records, reports, and anything that might explain why her parents had never returned. Myra stayed at the terminal each year, as she always had, but now she wasn't completely alone. Elias would sit nearby, always careful not to intrude, but always present. Myra began to feel a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in years. She realized that while she had waited alone for so long, there was now a human who genuinely cared about her story, who was willing to walk alongside her as she confronted a past she hadn't understood. Over time, a subtle bond developed between Mira and Elias. He didn't try to replace her parents or rush her healing. He simply offered a steady presence, someone who would listen, observe, and help her navigate the unknown. Mira began to see that waiting didn't have to mean being completely alone. She started to share her thoughts, her fears, and even her dreams, something she hadn't done with anyone before. The red ribbon in her hair became a symbol not only of her hope for her parents, but also of her willingness to trust someone new, someone who respected her patience and her story. Through Elias's quiet guidance, Mira began to imagine the possibility of a life where she could hold on to hope without being consumed by it. She realized that her annual return to the terminal wasn't just about waiting for her parents anymore. It was about preserving a part of herself, a part that had survived years of uncertainty and fear. And now, with Elias by her side, she began to understand that some truths, even if painful, could help her heal rather than hurt her. By the time Mira finished telling her story to Elias, he understood that her waiting was not just a habit, but a profound act of love. She had held on to the memory of her parents and the promise of their return for so long that it had become a defining part of who she was. Elias recognized that helping Mira wouldn't be simple, but it was necessary. She needed to know the truth, and she needed someone patient enough to help her face it without breaking her spirit. And so, the human who noticed her, the one who had quietly observed her for weeks, before stepping forward, became the first real support in her life. Myra's story of waiting, patience, and hope was no longer hers alone. It was now shared with someone who understood its weight and its beauty. She hadn't stopped hoping, but for the first time in years, she knew she didn't have to carry that hope entirely by herself. Mira had spent years holding on to the hope that her parents would return to the bus terminal. She had carried that memory like a small flame, lighting the dark corners of uncertainty in her young life. Now, with Elias helping her, she began to realize that the answers she had been waiting for all these years might finally be within reach. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. For the first time, she understood that waiting could lead not just to disappointment, but also to truth or truth she might not be ready for, yet needed more than anything else. Elias began by carefully piecing together every detail Mira could remember. He asked her about the day her parents left her, the time of day, the buses that were coming and going, the faces she remembered in the crowd. Mira described the way the terminal looked, the sounds she had heard, and even the small things, the red ribbon her mother had tied, the smell of bread from the nearby kiosk, and the green trash can by the ticket counter. Elias wrote everything down, mapping it against records and reports from that time. Each small detail became a clue, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for so many years. Next, Elias reached out to authorities and checked public records. He reviewed missing persons reports, shelter logs, and travel records from the day Mira had first been left at the terminal. The process was slow and painstaking. There were moments of frustration when files were incomplete or contradictory, and Mira felt the familiar pang of anxiety, worrying that the truth might not be found at all. Yet Elias remained patient and reassuring, reminding her that finding answers was a process that could not be rushed. He reminded her that even waiting all these years had prepared her to face the truth with strength as they dug deeper. Pieces of Mira's past began to surface. They discovered that the day her parents had left her at the terminal had not gone as anyone had planned. A tragic bus accident had occurred, one that claimed the lives of her parents before they could return. The news had never reached Mira in a way she could understand, and the shelter had only recorded her as a lost child. For years she had believed she had been abandoned. But now the painful reality was slowly unfolding. Her parents had never abandoned her. They had never come back because they had been taken from her. When Mira first heard this, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. Shock, sadness, grief, and relief all collided in a way that left her almost speechless. She had waited for so long, holding on to hope that her parents would return, and now she knew that they never could. Her heart ached as she imagined what had happened to them, the lives they might have still lived, and the moment when they had been taken from her forever. She felt an emptiness she hadn't anticipated, a void where hope and love had once lived. Yet amid the pain, there was also relief. She finally had an answer, a reason for the years of waiting. And she no longer had to carry the unbearable uncertainty that had defined so much of her life. Elias stayed beside her through this process, providing support without rushing her grief. He understood that this was not a moment to fix or solve. It was a moment to witness and validate. Mira learned to cry freely for the first time in years, releasing emotions she had held back, believing that expressing them might somehow betray her parents' memory. She talked about her parents, imagining the lives they might have wanted for her, and remembering the warmth and love they had shown, even in the small moments she could recall. Each memory became a treasure, a way to keep them alive in her heart. Over time, Mira began to process what this truth meant for her own life. She realized that waiting, while it had been painful, had also taught her resilience and patience. It had shaped her into someone who could observe, understand, and empathize with others in a way few her age could. She had learned to hold on to hope while facing uncertainty, a skill that now became a source of strength rather than sorrow. The terminal, once a place of longing and waiting, transformed in her mind into a symbol of endurance and courage. Elias helped Mira understand that her parents' love for her had never ended, even if their lives had been cut short. He guided her to remember the lessons they had unintentionally taught her, the importance of patience, hope, and faith in the face of uncertainty. Mira began to write about her experience, capturing her emotions and memories in notebooks she had long carried with her. Writing became a way to honor her parents, to tell their story, and to give herself permission to heal. She could finally acknowledge her grief and hold on to the love she had for them, without it consuming her entirely. As Mira continued to come to terms with the truth, she also started to see the role that Elias had played in her life. He had noticed her, approached her with care, and helped her face a truth she might never have discovered on her own. Through his presence, she realized that humans could enter one's life and make a difference, offering support, understanding, and guidance without replacing what had been lost. Elias became a steady figure in her life, someone she could trust and rely on as she learned to navigate a world that had once seemed overwhelmingly lonely. Mira also began to visit the terminal differently now. The bench she had once clung to with the hope of seeing her parents became a place of reflection. She observed the people around her with empathy, understanding that each person carried their own stories and struggles. The terminal, once a symbol of longing and uncertainty, became a space where she could honor her past while acknowledging the present. She realized that waiting had taught her something valuable, the ability to hold on to love even when the people we love are gone. The process of discovering the truth was not quick or easy. Mira faced moments of sadness that seemed unbearable, moments when the loss felt fresh and raw despite the years that had passed. But with Elias by her side, she began to understand that healing was not about forgetting or replacing the past. It was about integrating it into her life, carrying it with her as a source of strength. She learned to feel both sorrow and gratitude simultaneously, honoring the lives of her parents while embracing the life she still had. By the end of this journey, Mira had changed profoundly. The waiting that had defined so much of her childhood no longer held her captive. She had faced the truth, embraced the memories of her parents, and learned to live with the knowledge of what had happened. Her resilience, patience, and love had carried her through years of uncertainty, and now they became the foundation for the next chapter of her life. She began to imagine a future where she could pursue her dreams, form new connections, and create a life that honored her parents. Memory without being limited by it, the discovery of the truth marked a turning point for Mira. She no longer needed to wait for a return. That would never happen. Instead, she could focus on living, on building relationships, and on finding meaning in her life. The terminal remained a special place in her heart, but its meaning had shifted from a place of hope tinged with fear to a place of remembrance, courage, and love. Mira understood that while she could not change the past, she could carry its lessons forward. shaping a future that was informed by both her grief and her strength. Through it all, Elias remained a constant presence, guiding her, supporting her, and helping her understand that while the truth could be painful, it could also set her free. Mira began to trust humans again, learning that connections could be built even after loss, that love and kindness could enter life unexpectedly, and that patience and hope could still have a place in the world, even after tragedy. Mira had carried the memory of the bus terminal, the hope of seeing her parents, and the pain of uncertainty for more than a decade. Now, after discovering the truth about the day her parents had died, she was free from the endless waiting, yet she felt a strange emptiness. For years her life had revolved around the idea of reunion. The bench under the clock, and the belief that if she just waited long enough, everything would be as it had been. Facing the reality that her parents would never return was painful, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter. Mira had to learn what it meant to live without waiting, to find meaning in the world beyond the bench she had clung to for so long. For the first time in years, Mira visited the terminal without expectation. She walked slowly, observing the same details she had memorized. The kiosks, the people, the buses arriving and departing. The red ribbon in her hair, which she had worn every year since she was a little girl, now felt like a symbol not of hope for a return, but of the strength and patience she had shown throughout her life. Mira looked at the familiar bench, the one that had been the center of her universe for so long, and felt a mixture of nostalgia and release. It was a sacred place to her, but she no longer needed to stay there in order to hold on to her parents' memory. Elias, who had been with Mira through the discovery of the truth, now became a steady presence in her life in a new way. He did not try to replace her parents, nor did he rush her into moving on. Instead, he supported her as she navigated the complicated emotions that followed the revelation: grief, relief, confusion, and even a sense of freedom. Elias encouraged her to explore the world outside the terminal, to think about what she wanted for herself, and to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. For Mira, this was both exciting and terrifying. She had spent so many years defined by waiting that she was unsure how to live without it. Over the following months, Mira began to build a life that was no longer bound by the past. She attended school, made friends, and explored interests that she had previously ignored in favor of her annual ritual. Art, which she had always loved but only used to document the terminal, became a way to express her emotions fully: her grief, her hope, and her emerging joy. She drew landscapes, imagined stories, began to see herself as an individual capable of creating a life beyond the memory of her parents' loss. Elias continued to guide her gently, helping her navigate challenges and celebrating her small victories, despite moving forward. Mira never forgot the bus terminal or the years she had spent waiting. One day she decided to return to the bench, not to wait but to say goodbye. She wanted to honor the years of hope, patience, and love that had shaped her, to acknowledge the significance of the place in her life. Standing there, she traced the familiar patterns she had memorized so long ago: the tiles, the benches, and the clocks. She remembered her small hands clutching the bench edge, her eyes scanning the crowd, and the determination that had carried her through years of uncertainty. For a moment, Mira allowed herself to feel all the emotions she had stored: longing, sadness, pride, and finally, release. Elias was with her, standing quietly nearby, offering support without interrupting the intimate connection Mira was making with the place. His presence reminded her that humans could enter her life in meaningful ways, offering stability, care, and understanding even when the past was painful. Mira realized that while she had waited for her parents all those years, the human who came to her life, Elias, showed her that waiting didn't have to mean isolation. Connection was possible, even after tragedy. Mira began to understand that her parents' love had never disappeared. Even though they were no longer alive, it lived within her, in the lessons she had learned from them, the resilience she had developed, and the kindness she carried in her heart. She could honor their memory without being consumed by the past, and she could begin to form relationships that were grounded in the present rather than longing for the past. She started volunteering at local shelters, helping other children who had been separated from their families, sharing her patience and empathy in ways she never could have imagined as a child. The act of moving forward was gradual. Some days, the grief returned strongly, and Mira would feel as if the years of waiting had been wasted. Other days, she felt a surge of empowerment, realizing that surviving those years had given her insight and strength that many adults never experience. Each visit to the terminal became a ritual of reflection rather than expectation. She no longer counted the hours for a possible return, but instead counted the ways she had grown, the lessons she had learned, and the people who had entered her life to help her heal. Mira's transformation was not only emotional, but also deeply practical. She began to envision a future where she could pursue her dreams, build friendships, and create a life that honored her parents while embracing new experiences. She worked hard in school, nurtured her artistic talents, and allowed herself to hope not for the return of her parents, but for opportunities and relationships that could bring meaning to her life. The terminal, once a place of longing, became a quiet reminder of her journey and a symbol of how far she had come. Over time, Mira's relationship with Elias deepened, but it was never dependent or controlling. He became a mentor and a trusted adult, someone she could rely on to offer guidance while respecting her autonomy. Together they reflected on the past, celebrated her growth, and planned for the future. Through this relationship, Mira learned that human connection could provide comfort, stability, and support even in the absence of those we have lost. She realized that healing was not about replacing her parents or forgetting them. It was about integrating their memory into her life, while allowing herself to move forward. Mira also began to reconnect with the community around the terminal. People who had once noticed her waiting with curiosity or admiration now saw her differently, as a young woman who had endured years of uncertainty and emerged with compassion, strength, and grace. She shared her story quietly, hoping to inspire empathy and understanding in others. Mira's presence became a reminder that even in the face of loss and hardship, resilience and hope could survive, and that human connection could transform lives in ways we cannot always predict. The final visits to the terminal became moments of gratitude. Mira would sit for a while, watching the world move around her, reflecting on the journey that had shaped her life. She allowed herself to remember her parents with love, acknowledging the loss while celebrating the life they had given her and the strength she had developed in their absence. She could now leave the terminal without a sense of emptiness, understanding that life offered new opportunities for love, connection, and purpose. Mira's journey had come full circle. The years of waiting had given her patience, empathy, and resilience. The truth about her parents had brought both grief and clarity, allowing her to release the burden of uncertainty. The presence of Elias, a human who saw her, understood her, and supported her, showed her that life could still bring meaningful relationships. And finally, her own strength and determination allowed her to embrace the future, to build a life that honored the past while moving confidently toward what lay ahead in the end. Mira learned that waiting was not the same as living, and that love and hope could survive even the greatest loss. She no longer waited for a return that could never happen, but she also did not let go of the memory of her parents. Instead, she carried it with her, alongside the connections she formed and the life she was now free to create. Mira had transformed from a child frozen in hope into a young woman capable of hope, action, and love. And she finally understood that sometimes the person who helps us heal is not the one we lost, but the one who chooses to walk beside us when we are ready.